Hi guys, and welcome back to Brain-Friendly Thinking. Let me just get everything set up. And while we're waiting for people to arrive, let me just quickly recap what we've done, or what I've done last time on the show. Last time was quite a bit of a heavy, well, more or less heavy math session, depending on what your standards are. I guess for most people it was quite a heavy math session. For a mathematician it would be, or a theoretical physicist or something, it would be just scratching the surface. And I don't want to recap everything, just some of the highlights. Essentially, I continued working on how can we put the models that I am trying to develop, and I started developing in some of the previous videos. How can I put that into a mathematical form? And I discovered a paper from visual science, not from touch, but from visual science, that has a very promising approach and does exactly that. So I went through that a little bit to try to understand it. And specifically, I wanted to show off a method I developed a long time ago, actually by now more than 10 years ago, and which I think is quite good to decode these formulae. I write down the formulae and then I highlight the individual elements. I decode them by writing down what they mean, and sometimes I will write a second level and a third level, fourth level, and so on. Here I only did two second level ones. Once. I only did second levels twice. So, and then I also used actually a couple of CaGas to try to explain certain things while I was thinking through this. Okay, I don't want to go into too much detail because otherwise I would to speak an entire hour just about this again. But let's start with a blank sheet of paper. What I would like to do today is I would like to return to something that is more visual, go away from the math heavy stuff, but still work on what I began before. And specifically, I would like to, let me get my Zettelkasten, I would like to return to some of the CaGas that I showed some time ago. And actually, while I'm at it, I might just add a digression here. The way that Luhmann seems to have been using the Zettelkasten, or have been navigating the Zettelkasten, and the way that, what's his name, the guy from San Diego, it's on the tip of my tongue, Scott Scheper also uses or navigates his Zettelkasten, seems to be by the index, which in my case, look, is at the very end. So let me take that out for a moment. The index here. However, I found so far I'm not using the index an awful lot. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I still have such a small Zettelkasten. Or maybe it is because my mind works slightly differently. What I found instead is that I am... Sorry, can I... Now you should be able to read this. And what I find is that I'm more of navigating my Zettelkasten, let's call it spatially maybe. It's sort of as if in my mind there is a structure of the Zettelkasten, and so I know roughly where the Zettels are within in the Kasten. So I know what I want to find out now. I know is definitely in the first subcategory, systems, and then within that first subcategory it is somewhere it was in self-organization or system control, but some of those, I think 1.3 something, if I remember correctly. So this is 1.3, yes, and I can already see, just from looking at the Zettel's mean locomotion error, this is most likely correct, but it is, let me thumb through, it's slightly further in the back, so it's sort of a partially a, let's call it, abstract spatial representation of the Zettelkasten, and partially a real spatial one, that where I roughly know how many Zettels do I need to go backwards or forwards, and it can take a bit of time. Where is that? Okay, that's what I wanted to find. So this is the next node in the tree I'm trying to traverse, and it got two sub branches. I'm interested in the first one, touch, and there, and now I'm switching to the other spatial representation. There it is comparatively close to the beginning. That means I don't have to flip over that many Zettels. Oh, I just think I saw it. There we go. There we go. Nice. That's what I want. That's what I want. Great. I want this Zettel here. And I want this Zettel and this Zettel. Awesome. Whoop, with that out of the way, I can put my Zettelkasten away. And I got the 3 Zettels I need. And if you watched some of my previous videos on this show, you might recognize them, because I talked about them before. The reason why I want to talk about them again is that I'm currently reading a paper which is in preprint, where the first author is Fuchs, and that gave me some new ideas of how to think, how to conceptualize these models here, and that is something I would like to explore today. So, and I'm actually not quite sure how I want to begin that, but essentially, where can I start? Let me start with a little tree model, because these three models here, and before I try to integrate those two, according to the authors, are actually 3 different types. What did they call them? Let's try to work the memory. Repetition is supposed to be good for learning. One of them was process oriented. One of them was representational. You can almost read this. And the other one was remapping. And with that I can actually categorize things, because this model here by Miller is process oriented, and by the way also the model that I looked at last week is process oriented. Then Head is remapping and Longo is representation. And if this was true, me trying to map those two does not make sense. Good. What is the representational approach? If we look at our brain, if this is the cortex, this is the outer part of the brain with the little grooves inside, which are called sulci, then you might have seen some images like that. In some images you have almost like a little person spread out over the cortex, but with their limbs or with their body parts not in the right not in the right orientation. I will probably do it exactly the wrong way around. It is something along the line of the face here, and I think even with the eyes. Then we have some pretty big lips. And then we have a hand, which I can't draw, but which should look something like that. And the feet are definitely most lateral. There are some other things missing. Don't quote me on this, but something like that. What this shows is which cells in the brain light up when you touch different parts of the body. So if I touch the hand, this part of the brain lights up. If I touch my lips, this part of the brain lights up, and so on and so forth. And you see several things. One thing you see is that things tend to be clustered together. First of all, that means everything that is processed from the hand is in one area, everything that is processed from the lips is in another area, where the foot is another area, and so on and so forth. What you also notice is that things tend to be, let's call it, separated. So the hand is not necessarily, or the lips are separated from the rest of the face. The hand is not necessarily where the arm is, or it's not represented in exactly the same way as it is in reality. And thirdly, some areas of the body have much larger representation than others. The lips have a very large representation, and the whole hand, with the fingertips in particular, also have a large representational area in the brain. And again, that means that if I touch you somewhere on the body, this is the part of the brain, of the cortex, that lights up. Now, the idea behind the representational approach, that would be this one here, is that these representations help the body to know where it has been touched. So that means, let's draw a little finger, a very crude representation of a finger. There are some cells inside, and they, via certain intermediate parts, they are connected to the cortex. They are connected to the cortex, so the cortex lights up. And the idea is, this provides value. How can I represent that? I could draw a little light bulb. Something like that. And then the body knows, well, that's where I've been touched. And any deviation from, if I touch you at one point and you respond, or you feel that you've been touched in a slightly different point, or at a completely different point, this, according to this representational view, can be explained by that these maps have inherent distortions. There are upstream brain regions that can compensate for that to a certain point, up to a certain point, but there are inherent distortions within the brain. And so essentially this whole thing determines where we feel the touch. If an insect lands somewhere in our hand, it is by this brain area that we know where we've been touched. Representational. Processing is quite a bit different, and I did not realize that, or I did not appreciate it maybe too much until just yesterday. What is the process-oriented view? that actually goes back to information theory. It goes all the way back to Shannon, but it also goes back to principles that are currently used in telecommunication, IT, and so on and so forth. When the original idea, and I draw it in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the brain, but the original idea by Claude Shannon was that you have a message, you then have a transmitter, and the transmitter does something to the message. So I get to that in a moment. You have a receiver, and then you have a destination. And what Claude Shannon, he wrote this in 1947, 1948, somewhere around that time, and where he came from was the telephone, telegraph, television, anything with tele, but essentially you have one person trying to send a message, let's say over the telephone. Then you have the telephone itself. So let me draw an old style telephone receiver, something like that might represent the telephone. When you have a message, in the original version of Claude Shannon's theory, there was a person speaking, and the sound goes into the telephone, and the telephone apparatus, let's use the old-fashioned term apparatus here, does something to the message. In the simplest case, it just translates it into an electrical signal, but it might do lots of other things to it. Now at the receiving end, you have in this case again a telephone, where the information comes out, and you do a reverse transform. So essentially in the original theory by Shannon, whatever the transmitter did to the message, the receiver would undo. And then finally you have the destination, which is a person again. So let's draw it in a way that it looks opposite direction, and the important thing here is the ear. And you got sounds coming into the ear. But the important thing is the first part of the chain is a human, the last part of the chain is a human, and in between you have a transformation and an exact reverse transformation, and then you have noise. Essentially, whatever leaves this transmitter here on its way to the receiver gets distorted. Good. That was the original. Of course, there have been lots of progression since then, and you don't necessarily need a human here and here, and you also don't necessarily need a exact reverse transform, I guess. Also, the act of transforming and reverse transforming can already be noisy. That's important. And so what the processing framework or model tries to explain is you have the tactile input, you have some somatotopic encoding, and that means soma means the body and topos means the place, so you encode the place where on the body you've been touched, and you do that via this homunculus here, via the brain region, just like in the representational view, but in the process view. And this is the point that I did not appreciate enough before. In the process view, whatever it is that is happening in this part of the brain does not tell the brain where it has been stimulated. The brain does something to the stimulus. We don't know what, but it does something to the stimulus. And then it is passed on to the next station, just like with the telephone. So the original message would be the stimulus, then you have a transmitter, not actually, or the transformation actually not only happens at the cortex, by the way, but there are also some stages before where some transformation is occurring. Then you send it to the next station where another transformation occurs, which is, however, not the reverse transformation of this encoding. And then you pass it on to the next one, where another transformation occurs, and it's again not the reverse transformation. But you have essentially a chain of transformations, and each of them, as indicated by the little lightning bolts here, are noisy, inherently noisy. And this is the process view. Good. Good. Then what about the remapping? The remapping, how can I try to put this into a CaGa? That's not so easy. Essentially, the remapping says there is some form of abstract representation of the space, and whatever we get as a concrete activation needs to be transformed to this abstract space, and only once it's in that abstract space, that's when the actual localization happens. So maybe I could do something like this. This is supposed to be it's a lattice, it's essentially a network, a very simple network. And that represents some abstract space. There is some indication that this is probably visual, but let's just call this an abstract space. And then I have further networks. One of them would be a touch space. Another one could be a visual space. And there's a transformation of some sort. That brings the concrete spaces into this abstract space, which might be visual. And then let me get another color. Essentially, hey, where's red? Thank you. Essentially, this part here in the visual brain, and the visual space lights up. And because of the transformation, let's say this part here in the abstract space lights up. And then the brain knows, let me use the same CaGa for all of them. That's where I've been touched. Where here it's the destination, which is not a human, but a part in the brain. Then that's when I know where I've been touched. Okay. And also, if at the same time there would be a representation in visual space, then where the abstract space lights up could be different. And according to the remapping model, that determines what drives the localization. And what I tried to do a couple of weeks ago in one of these sessions here, let me see whether I can find my no, not this one here. Great. What I try to do is I essentially try to unify all three of them. And specifically I took these two and I tried to see where do they correspond. I had tactile efference here, so that's the neural pathways going towards the brain. Going to superficial schema, I took this from one of them, and on the other one we have the skin location, and I said, okay, so the tactile efference and the superficial schema together, this is my skin location. But now with this new information, I think my understanding was not correct. Whether this thing here is correct or not is another question, but my understanding was not correct. Which of course shows you that that it takes time to construct these things little by little. And now I have to say essentially these two Zettels here, according to this new view, and I don't know yet whether I completely agree with this view, but according to this new view, yeah, longer would be this one here and head would be this one here. They are incompatible. Okay, interesting. Right now I personally am leaning mostly towards this one here, but I shouldn't let this cloud my vision. Good. Cool, so this is one thing. Just for the sake of completeness, there was a fourth model that this paper mentioned, which I think was called embodied model, and that said we have to take both the sensing part of, so essentially, sorry if I interrupt myself, but I'm thinking, obviously this is live thinking, I'm thinking as I'm speaking. So during an experiment, let's say I touch you at one point of your hand and you're responding. The response might be with a pen again on your hand. But this whole thing constitutes a single experiment, and this embodied model says we cannot separate sensation from motor action. They are necessarily linked together. Let's see whether I can also put this into a CaGa. How could I? Okay, my first inclination would be to represent this by boxes. So I do this. We have sense. We have motor. And then I draw a box around this. And I say we have certain inputs, we have certain outputs. And what's happening inside, we can't disentangle. So actually this is wrong. What I drew is actually wrong. This doesn't represent the embodied model. The embodied model says that we can exactly not do this. We can only ever, well, I don't know whether this is actually true, this might not be fair, that we can only ever, but essentially we have something like a black box. Something goes in, the stimulus goes in, the response comes out. And we have to look at the whole thing, which makes a lot of sense to me, which makes a lot of sense to me. That's exactly what I'm trying to do as well. So we are aligned there already. Great. Let's say we have the stimulus, we have the response. But my understanding is that the embodied model says you cannot open the black box. You cannot look inside. You cannot separate the different elements. This might be an unfair representation, simply because I don't understand the embodied model yet. I only got the summary from that paper I was reading, and it might be that I misunderstand what they wanted to say about the embodied model. But that was my current understanding. You have some sort of a black box that you can't open, that you don't know what's inside, and you're never able to open that. Which I would say it's not all that helpful. So my idea would be using something like this process model to actually help decompose this black box into a white box. However, the interactions will be much more complicated than what this process model shows. For one thing, what we already know, we have the thalamus. We have the medulla. The stimulus comes in here, goes to the medulla, where there is a summary information. It goes to the thalamus. I don't know whether there is a feedback loop here, but next it comes to the cortex, specifically the primary somatosensory cortex, or S1 for short. And we know there is definitely a feedback loop here, which means that the response of the thalamus also depends on the response of S1. And likely in a non-trivial way, in a non-linear way. And I'm trying to think of an example from touch at the moment. And I can't think of one, but for vision that's definitely true. We also have higher brain areas. Or maybe downstream, higher areas. Downstream. Downstream areas that receive input from the lower areas and that definitely also send information back. I can't think of an example at the moment from touch. One example I remember from vision is there was this experiment where they showed people, okay, so they had an object here and they had a hand here in a neutral position, and the hand was making a reaching movement to grab this object. Sometimes there was an obstacle in the way, sometimes not. They only showed the participants a short clip from the entire sequence, and after a second or two, I can't remember how long, or maybe even a split second, they stopped the movement, they stopped the image, or they stopped the movie, and the participants had to say where was the hand in the last frame of the movie. There are two types of reaching movements. One was a direct reaching movement, and another one was a sort of more parabolic, more angular reaching movement. You can imagine if there's an obstacle, you need to actually do a more curved reaching movement to reach over the obstacle. If there's no obstacle, then it would be more energy efficient to do a direct reaching movement. And the thing is that whether the participants, or where the participants thought that the hand was at the end of this little movie clip depended on whether there was an obstacle or not. Essentially, the brain of the participants calculated how would I do the reaching movements optimally under the condition, under the context, and that got back propagated, and then they said, okay, that's where I saw the hand in the last still of the movie. And this is for me a very beautiful illustration of that there is definitely a feedback loop between higher brain areas and lower brain areas, and there are other examples like this as well, but this is especially interesting. Good. So, and if this is what the embodied model says that's happening, it says we can't take out those feedback loops. This unidirectional model, or it's sometimes called feed-forward model, where you have one area and that goes to the next area, and that's when you make the localization, and that goes to the next area, which makes the planning of the response. This does not work. Our body simply worked, our brain doesn't work like that. I would totally agree with that. But the question then is, how can we still figure out the individual pieces involved and how they transfer information from one to the other and back again? How does it interact with memory and all of these things? So from my understanding from that paper currently, and this might change, of course, it will change definitely, but currently I'm leaning towards integrating the process and the embodied model view. Good. So here I have a couple of CaGas for the different models, in a very simplified way. Sorry, you can't see that. How do I progress next? What do I do next? I said I'm gonna, in the title of this video, I said I'm gonna do a CaWa, so this might be a good time to start this CaWa. I simply gonna use model. I simply gonna use model as my word, my little balloon characters. And now. What are the concepts? What are the keywords that I actually want to add to this central word? I could have representational, process, remapping, and embodied. We do have an E for embodied model, great. We don't have R, P, and R again. So it's time for creative cheating. So let me put embodied here. What are the other types? Representational. What do we have other languages? I guess in French or German it would also be written with an R. What is another word for representation? An image? Maybe it's an image-based? Maybe the remapping, we have an M for, yeah, let's actually use that. Remapping. So what are so we have representation, we have image, but we don't have an I either. But if I'm at an image, although maybe image is not the right word. What did they call this? They call this a schema. A superficial schema, a postural schema. I don't have an S either. Great, so that doesn't help me. Do I have other words for image? Image could be a picture. It could be a sketch. What other words do I have for image? It could be an icon. An image is an icon. That might work in this context. I could use icon, I-C-O-N here. I could do it like that. I'm not entirely certain I like that. I'm not entirely certain I like that. Maybe I do. We also have process. Actually, let me just use icon. We also have process. So how can I add the process to the CaWa? What is another word for process? Process is a sequence of steps. I believe even that is what process literally means. Process literally translated is a sequence of steps, but I don't have S. I don't have S again. I have O for sequence of steps, but I don't like that. I have... Can I do something with the L? L. I have leg. That would have something to do with the step, but I don't see process. What else? A process would be a change. Okay. Process means a change. I don't have a C either. This is a nice word. I like this. I have T for transformation, T for transmitter. A process. A process is well, you know what? You know what? A transformation is remodeling, and I actually think I like that. I think this modeling. How do you write modeling? I like that because the process model is a continuous reshaping of the same information. Good. Good, 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 good. But what is part of the model as well is the stimulus and response. What's another word for stimulus? This is really tough one actually. Model is a really tough one for the words I'm trying to embed into that. Response. Response could be an answer. A model. A stimulus. A stimulus. But actually the important thing is whether the stimulus and the response can be separated from one another. How can you say separate? Separate, detached. Yes, that's nice. I like that. So that's how I can do it. Yes, I can detach. Not detached, but detachable. Question mark. And actually, let me make this bigger. Question is, are they detachable? Are what detachable? Are stimulus and response? No, not stimulus, sorry, beg your pardon, not the sensing. Can the sensing be cleanly detached from the response? Is it the case that we first sense something and then we plan our response? That is what representational and process and remapping model all, so now embodying these three here, they are all assuming. whereas the embodied model does not assume that. Okay, we have detachable, that's great, I like that. I like that. I want to get behavior in there as well, because it's actually it's all about input and output. Yes, it's input to output. Unfortunately, I don't have an I for input. I don't have a P for put either. I could do it like this. No, I could do entrance to output, entrance to exit. No, it's not really. Entrance is not the same as input. I do have, what is another word for input? Input. What's another word for input? Let me say, well, let's just do it like that. Input to output, and then I attach it to the O. There was something else that just crossed my mind. No, I can't think of it right now, but I will write down loops simply as a reminder. And by loop, I specifically mean feedback loops. Yes. Cool. Okay, cool. So now we can read this CaWa. The model. There are specific parts. Or the model. Hang on. No. This is how we can read the CaWa that we just created. The model shows us how we go from inputs to outputs. And there are different types of models. They can be essentially separated into two parts, and the question is the sensing part detachable from the response? For those models who assume that, they fall into three categories: the remapping models, the remodeling models, or the icon-based models. The remapping, we first have a certain touch space, or we have certain concrete spaces, and they are remapped into an abstract space, and depending on what is inside these spaces depends on what is inside these concrete spaces. It determines what the localization will be in, or the sensing what will be in the abstract space. So cool. So this is the remapping. The icon-based means wherever in the cortex the stimuli are first registered, processed, this is where we essentially localize the touch, and after that it is molded, it is a bit stretched or whatever, but essentially the most fundamental errors, they happen in this part. This is the icon. This is the icon based, and the remodeling based is along the whole chain we got a remodeling. At every stage we have a remodeling going on. And then the embodied says, well, we can't detach, not detachable, we can't detach sensing from response. We have to look at it holistically, systemically, if you like. Beg your pardon. And I think that maybe this process model and the embodied model is not such a big difference as the paper made out to be. And the reason for that are feedback loops that I got here. Okay. Cool. This is, let me get a few colored pens and pencils. Not pencils, just pens. What are the... And let's see whether I can add a little bit of color to my CaWa. And while I'm doing that, what I actually find works very well when you color in the CaWa like that is that your mind, for whatever reason, continues to think about the topic of the CaWa, but in a more, shall I call it, relaxed way, maybe more subconscious way. I don't know how to express that. There's a different way of doing CaWas, begging pardon, CaWas, where you start already with the word. So essentially I would write something like that, right? I would write model the M in this color and then the O in that color, and I do it all at the beginning, and then I do my normal CaWa. But I don't like this, and I think this is only a personal preference. I don't say that one method of doing the CaWa is necessarily better than the other, but what I find for myself, and this is also something that I've heard from some other people, is that doing it the way I'm doing it now, having sort of like balloon letters, and then coloring them in after you finish the CaWa. This is sort of a very nice closing ritual, if you like, where you zone out a little bit, don't think very consciously about your CaWa anymore, but subconsciously you still engage with it. And yes, I find this very interesting, very fascinating. So we have the input. Let me write the error as well in the output, and we of course have the icon. It's just fascinating. It's just fascinating. So the next one, D. Ooh, this is a bit. Can you even see that? I don't think so. Let's use that color instead then. Yeah, that shows up on the screen as well. Great. Yeah, also while I'm doing that, while I'm at this, I might just add a couple of other sort of observations, as in, yeah, what do I actually want to say? One of the things you can see in this video right now, I started up here with a few relatively simple CaWas, CaGas, God. Can you see that color? And then afterwards I progress to the CaWa and doing, I mean the order does not necessarily matter, but I find for myself, and this is very personal, I find for myself that doing it in that order is somehow the CaWa is more like a nice, it's a way of closing things off. Oh, I'm running out of ink here. It's nice as a closure point. I personally don't use the CaWa very often at the start. I use it more at the end, more like where have we got to, sort of like a knowledge repository. And this is, as I said, this is very personal. So everybody needs to think about or experiment with that themselves, and then find out what works for them and what doesn't work. Great. So we have one loop and we have the other loop. Great. Good. Nice. Let me also take a moment to go back over the sheets. Let me try to put them in the right order. It started with robotics. Right, then I think this came next. And this came definitely before that one here, and I believe this came here. Right, so if we look at everything together, what does that show us? I started off thinking about how can touch and how can neuroscience, how can sensing in general help us design better robot control systems. We have the brain, we want to transfer to the control system. We have inputs to outputs, we have tasks, we have rewards, and so on and so forth. Then I can't remember what the order was, but then here is when I start to actually work on my model. And what you can see, or what I can see, I hope you can see it too, is that right from the very beginning I had this sort of process model in my mind. Physical transformation is translated, then we have a translation, a conduction, a summation, another translation, encoding, and so on and so forth. So this model by Miller et al., when I first saw it, that made an awful lot of sense to me. I can't actually remember. I can sort of almost a little bit remember. I mean, I know what I drew this. This is when I showed how the axon works. This is when I showed what the spike trains look like. And here we had the deformation. I remember. Was that in the same session as this one? I think the important bit was this CaGa down here, where I said there are certain transformations which I call topological transformations. Certain transformations where the information is recoded continuously, and I call this topological transformation, and there are others where you make a decision. Okay, then the next one is I went through and I tried to combine them in a way that I now realize makes potentially not as much sense as I originally thought it would, simply because I'm trying to combine incompatible models, two incompatible models within the framework of a third model. But it doesn't necessarily mean that what I've done here is altogether entirely wrong, and it definitely wasn't all in vain, because it's always processing, and the more you think about it, the more you understand, and when you read something, then suddenly something clicks. After that, I tried to get a bit more concrete, and I really struggled with that. I said, okay, we have the objective, the action, we have some sort of memory, and we have noise. You can see again, this is this model shining through, because that really makes a lot of sense to me. And I went into a little bit of digression with expertise. Then I did the really math heavy one last time, where I said, okay, how can we actually implement this? And I was reading a paper here, and I've shown you how you can decode this. Sorry. But all of that is, again, the processing model. And now today, if we compare this one here, this really in-depth formulae with the CaGas I've done today, the CaGas today are much more on the surface again. But underneath, there is still this knowledge that I built up over the past couple of, well, months by now. And now I see this is a central question here, the detachability. Embodied model or not embodied model? Can we detach sensing from response? And what does that mean for the robotics? Because in the end, that's what I really want to focus towards. So we're making baby steps, but every time a little bit further, and of course in between the sessions I'm also doing some more reading, some more thinking. I hope it is useful in so far also for you, not just for me, that you can see how an idea is really built over a longer period of time. How you come back to the same things again and again from a different angle. Sometimes you achieve something, sometimes you don't achieve something. And sometimes what you've done before, if you read something new, it's suddenly something clicks that would not have clicked before. Okay, that's where I want to leave it today. Thanks very much for watching, everybody. According to what OBS tells me, there is nobody in watching at the moment right now, which is fine. If there is something that is not picked up by OBS, now is your chance to ask me some questions. And of course, you always have the chance to ask questions beneath the video or in the comment section beneath the video. But I wish you a happy rest of the weekend, a good start into next week. If you found the video useful, please don't forget to give the like button a high five. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And until next time, keep thinking.